They told me my late father left nothing but a condemned mill house. What I found inside changed everything. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, or that the world had already written your story for you, maybe you'll want to stick around for this one. This isn't just about a house, it's about what we inherit and what we choose to build. So if that sounds like something you want to be a part of, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. The day I turned 18 was the day I officially ceased to exist as a problem for the state of Oregon. There was no fanfare, just a small, slightly squashed grocery store cake in a cardboard box, placed on the corner of a metal desk by my caseworker, Mrs. Gable. Its waxy frosting was the color of a faded bruise. "Happy birthday, Liam," she said, her voice holding the same practiced, weary kindness it had held for the past 2 years. 2 years since the accident. 2 years since my father, Thomas, had vanished from my life, leaving me to the sterile embrace of the system. I'd been a ward of the court, a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget. Now, I was just a guy with a cheap cake and a duffel bag containing everything I owned. Mrs. Gable pushed another envelope across the desk. It wasn't a birthday card. It was thick, beige, and official-looking. "This came for you, from a law office downtown. It pertains to your father's estate." I stared at it. Estate. The word sounded grand, important. It conjured images of oak-paneled rooms and leather-bound books. It didn't fit the man I remembered, or rather, the man I had constructed in my memory. A ghost who smelled of sawdust and disappointment. A man who couldn't hold a job, who let us slide into poverty, and who ultimately had abandoned me. "His estate," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He didn't have anything." Mrs. Gable gave a small, non-committal shrug. "The law requires you to be notified. You're his next of kin. You're an adult now, so it's your responsibility to deal with it." Responsibility. Another heavy word for an 18-year-old's shoulders. She handed me a bus pass with 2 weeks left on it and a check for $250, the grand parting gift from the state for my years of service as a foster kid. "Good luck, Liam," she said, and I knew she meant it, but her eyes were already drifting to the next file on her desk. I was already becoming a memory. I didn't touch the cake. The walk to the lawyer's office was a study in contrasts. The government building was all linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that hummed with a sound like dying insects. Downtown Portland was glass and steel, gleaming towers reflecting a sky the color of dishwater. I felt like a ghost haunting a world I didn't belong to, my worn-out sneakers silent on the polished granite sidewalks. I clutched the strap of my duffel bag, the single point of contact with my entire history. The law firm of Albright & Associates was on the 14th floor of one of those towers. The elevator ride was so smooth and quiet it made my ears pop. The receptionist, a woman with hair so perfect it looked like a helmet, eyed my duffel bag and faded hoodie with a look of polite suspicion. But when I said the name on the envelope, her expression shifted to one of professional neutrality. She led me to a conference room with a window that looked out over the entire city. It felt like being on top of the world, a place I had no business being. A few minutes later, a woman entered. She was tall, sharp, dressed in a dark gray suit that probably cost more than everything I owned put together. "Mr. Thorne? I'm Eleanor Albright." Her handshake was firm, her grip dry and cool. She didn't smile, but her eyes were direct, intelligent. She sat opposite me at the long, polished table, the city spread out behind her like a prop. "Thank you for coming in," she began, opening a file that looked identical to the one on Mrs. Gable's desk. "As you were likely informed, this concerns the estate of your father, Thomas Thorne." I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I hadn't heard his full name spoken aloud in years. "To be blunt, Liam," she said, her tone softening just a fraction, "your father's estate is not a boon. It is, in fact, a significant liability." She slid a document across the table. It was a property deed. Blackwood Mill, Hemlock Creek, Oregon. I'd never heard of it. "Your father purchased this property 6 years ago. It's an old timber mill and an adjacent house, located about 2 hours east of here. Unfortunately, the property has fallen into severe disrepair. The county has officially condemned the main house. It's uninhabitable, unsafe." She paused, letting the words sink in. Condemned. The word fit perfectly with the narrative I'd built. A failed man leaving behind a failed property. A ruin. "Furthermore," she continued, sliding another paper over, "there is a substantial lien against the property. Unpaid property taxes dating back 3 years, plus interest and penalties. The total comes to $43,712. I felt the air leave my lungs. $43,000. I had $250 in my pocket. It was a laughable, impossible number. It was a debt from a ghost. "So what does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It means the county will seize the property and sell it at auction to cover the debt. You, as the heir, would be left with nothing. In fact, depending on the sale price, you could theoretically be on the hook for the remainder." My head spun. This was my inheritance, not a gift, but a punishment. A final, parting anchor to drag me down just as I was supposed to be starting my life. I thought of the accident, the flash of headlights, the crunch of metal, the argument we'd had just before he'd stormed out, the guilt that had been my constant companion for 2 years, a cold stone in my gut. I'd always believed, deep down, that I was the reason he'd left, the reason he'd failed. This felt like the proof. He'd left me a mess because I was a mess. Ms. Albright watched my face, her expression unreadable. "This is the situation as it stands. It's a bad one. However," she said, her voice shifting, becoming more focused, "there is another option." She pulled a third envelope from her file. This one was different, crisp, white, with an embossed logo in the corner. "A company called Northwood Development has been trying to acquire the land your father's property sits on for some time. They wish to build a series of luxury cabins. They know about the tax lien. They've made an offer." She opened the envelope and slid a single sheet of paper towards me. It was a purchase offer. They were offering to buy the property, as is, for a total of $50,000. "The offer is structured to directly pay off the lien," she explained, her finger tracing the legal text. "The $43,712 would go directly to the county. The remaining $6,288 would go to you, free and clear." $6,000. To me, it was a fortune. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was food for 6 months. It was a bus ticket to anywhere. It was a clean break. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper, and the ghost of my father, along with his mountain of debt and his ruined house, would be gone forever. It was the logical choice, the only choice, the kind of choice a smart, responsible adult would make, the kind of choice Mrs. Gable would approve of. "They have the paperwork ready to go," Ms. Albright said. "We could have this finalized by the end of the day. The funds would be in your account within a week." She slid a pen across the table. It was heavy, black, and expensive. It rested on the paper, waiting. I looked from the pen to the window. The city gleamed, a world of possibilities that $6,000 could unlock. I could walk out of this office and never look back. I could leave Thomas Thorne and his failures buried in some forgotten corner of the state. It was what he had done to me, after all, just walked away. My hand reached for the pen. My fingers brushed against the cool metal. But I stopped. A thought, small and stubborn, surfaced through the noise of logic and fear. I had never seen it, this place, this condemned, worthless, broken piece of my father. It was the last thing he had owned, the last piece of him on earth. Could I just sign it away, unseen? Erase it without ever laying eyes on it? "I want to see it first," I said. The words came out stronger than I expected. Ms. Albright raised an eyebrow. "Liam, I have to advise you against that. The property is 2 hours away. It's condemned for a reason. There's nothing there for you but liability. And frankly, Northwood's offer is generous. It might not be on the table forever." "Still," I said, pulling my hand back from the pen, "I have to see it." A strange look passed over her face. It wasn't annoyance. It was something else. Maybe a flicker of respect. She sighed, a quiet exhalation of air. "Very well." She closed the file. "The decision is yours, at least until the county forecloses. I'll inform Northwood's attorneys that you are considering their offer." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small manila envelope, passing it to me. Inside was a single, rusty iron key. "This was with your father's personal effects. I assume it's for the house. I'll write down the address and the bus route for you." As I stood to leave, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, she said one more thing. "Liam, for what it's worth, your father spoke to me once, a long time ago, about that property. He called it his ark." Ark. The word hung in the air, strange and biblical. It made no sense. An ark is meant to save something. My father's house was a wreck, a sinking ship. It wasn't saving anything. It was drowning. I left her office with the rusty key in my pocket, its teeth digging into my palm. I didn't know it then, but I was walking away from more than just $6,000. I was walking toward a truth that was more complex and more painful than I could ever have imagined. The bus ride east was like traveling back in time. The sleek glass and concrete of Portland bled into the sprawling, identical suburbs, which in turn dissolved into rolling farmland and patches of dense, dark forest. The air that hissed from the vents above my seat started to smell less of exhaust and more of damp earth and pine. With every mile, I felt the institutional gray of my life peeling away, replaced by a vibrant, intimidating green. I was the only person who stayed on the bus for the final leg of the journey, a winding 2-lane road that followed the curves of a fast-moving river. The driver, a man with a weathered face and a kind smile, glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Getting off at Hemlock Creek?" he asked. I nodded. "Not much out there for a young fellow. You visiting family?" "Something like that," I said. The town of Hemlock Creek wasn't much of a town at all. It was a crossroads with a gas station, a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign, and a tavern with a flickering neon beer logo in the window. The bus hissed to a stop, and the driver wished me luck. I stepped out into the quiet. The air was cool and clean, filled with the sound of the river and the rustle of wind in the towering Douglas firs that crowded the edges of the road. It felt like another planet. I went into the general store. An old man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. I bought a heavy-duty flashlight, a pair of work gloves, a bottle of water, and a bag of jerky. He bagged my items without a word, his eyes lingering on me for a moment. I felt the question he didn't ask. "What are you doing here?" I didn't have an answer. The directions Ms. Albright had given me were simple. Follow the river road about a mile out of town. I started walking, my duffel bag feeling heavier with each step. The paved road soon turned to gravel, and the forest pressed in closer. The sound of the river grew louder, a constant, powerful rush. I could feel the spray in the air. Then I saw it. Through a break in the trees, a dilapidated wooden structure clinging to the riverbank. It was the mill. It was larger than I'd imagined, a multi-story skeleton of weathered gray wood, its windows like vacant eyes. A huge, rusted water wheel was half submerged in the churning water, motionless and green with moss. A narrow dirt path led from the gravel road, past the mill, and up a slight incline to a house. Condemned was the right word. It was a disaster. The roof on the porch had collapsed on one side, leaving it with a drunken, lopsided grin. Most of the windows were boarded up with plywood that was just as rotten as the siding. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood bare and vulnerable. Weeds and thorny bushes had consumed the yard, crawling up the sides of the house like they were trying to pull it back into the earth. It was a place that had given up. For a moment, I just stood there, a profound sense of despair washing over me. Ms. Albright was right. This was a grave, a monument to failure. My father's failure, my failure. I should have signed the papers. I should have taken the money and run. What was I doing here? But I had come this far. I pushed through the overgrown gate, the hinges screaming in protest. I walked up the sagging porch steps, testing each one before putting my full weight on it. The front door was swollen in its frame, a faded blue paint clinging to it in patches. I pulled the rusty key from my pocket. It felt cold and ancient in my hand. I slid it into the lock. It resisted, gritty with rust, but with a hard turn, there was a loud, satisfying clunk. The lock had opened. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed. It groaned, scraping against the floor, and swung inward into darkness. The air that rushed out was thick and heavy, the smell of a decade of dust, damp, and decay. It smelled like forgotten things. I pulled out the flashlight I'd just bought and clicked it on. The beam cut a bright, lonely circle in the gloom. I was standing in what must have been the living room. Furniture was draped in white sheets, their shapes like sleeping animals, covered in a layer of fine gray dust. Cobwebs as thick as cotton hung from the ceiling corners. The floor was a minefield of fallen plaster and debris. My light played over a stone fireplace, a sagging armchair, a stack of yellowed newspapers. It was a perfect time capsule of abandonment. I moved through the house with a growing sense of hollowness. The kitchen was worse. A fine layer of mold covered the countertops, and the open door of the refrigerator revealed a dark, empty cavern. I didn't want to look too closely. Everything I saw confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't an ark. It was a tomb. My father hadn't been building something here. He had been letting it die, just like he had let everything else in his life die. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. Anger at him for leaving me this mess, this literal and financial burden. Anger at myself for my stupid, sentimental need to come here. I was about to turn and leave, to walk back to town and call Ms. Albright and tell her to sell this godforsaken place to the developers, when I saw the stairs. They led up into the darkness of the second floor. Part of me screamed to just get out. The house felt unsafe, unsteady. But another part, the part that had made me come here in the first place, wouldn't let me leave. Not yet. I took the stairs one at a time, their creaks and groans echoing in the silence. The second floor had a small landing and 2 doors. The first door opened into a bedroom. An unmade bed with a bare mattress, an empty dresser. Nothing. The second door was closed. I tried the handle. It was locked. I tried the rusty key from Ms. Albright. It didn't fit. The lock was different, smaller. A locked room. Why? A flicker of curiosity cut through my anger. Why lock one room in a house that was already sealed to the world? I ran my flashlight beam over the door, the frame, the floor. There was no key hidden on the lintel, no loose floorboard nearby. I started to think about my father. He wasn't a tidy man, but he was clever with his hands, a tinkerer. He loved puzzles, hidden things. It was one of the few good memories I had, him showing me how to build a small box with a secret compartment. Where would he hide a key? I went back downstairs, my light scanning every surface. My gaze fell on the stone fireplace. It was the most solid thing in the whole house. I ran my hands over the rough-hewn stones of the mantel. Nothing. I knelt and looked into the firebox, shining my light on the soot-blackened bricks. I tapped them one by one. They were all solid. Then my light caught something. A faint scratch mark on the hearth, just outside the firebox. It was almost invisible under the layer of dust. I brushed the dust away. It was a deliberate mark, an arrow. It pointed to a single brick at the edge of the hearth. I pushed on it. It didn't move. I pulled on it. Nothing. I took out my pocket knife and worked the tip into the mortar around the brick. The mortar was loose, crumbling. I wiggled the knife back and forth, and the brick shifted. I pulled it out. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. And inside, nestled on a piece of velvet cloth, was a key. It was different from the first one. It was smaller, made of dark, almost black iron, with an ornate, clover-shaped head. It felt heavy with purpose. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I took the key and went back upstairs. I stood in front of the locked door, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a smooth, well-oiled click, the lock turned. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was not like the rest of the house. It wasn't a bedroom or a storage space. It was a workshop. A long, sturdy workbench ran along one wall, covered in tools that were meticulously organized, hung on a pegboard. There were vices, calipers, soldering irons. On another wall were shelves filled with books, not novels, but textbooks on engineering, hydrology, and electronics. Blueprints and schematics were pinned to a corkboard. In the center of the room, on a large drafting table, sat a single object, a heavy, dark wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with no visible lock or hinge. It felt like I had stepped through a portal. The rest of the house was a testament to decay, but this room was alive. It was a space of creation, of thought, of purpose. This was not the room of the man I thought I knew. I approached the wooden box on the drafting table. I ran my hands over its smooth, polished surface. There was a small, almost invisible seam running around its middle. I remembered the puzzle boxes my father used to make. I pressed on one corner, then another. I slid a panel on the side. A section of the lid popped up with a soft click. I lifted it. The air inside smelled of old paper and cedar. The box was full. It was filled to the brim with envelopes, bundled together with twine. They were all addressed in my father's familiar, spidery handwriting. To Liam. And on the top bundle, a small, handwritten tag read, "To be opened on your 18th birthday." My hands were shaking. I sat down on the dusty stool by the table, the flashlight beam trembling in my grip. I untied the twine on the top bundle. I pulled out the first envelope. It was thick, heavy. I tore it open. Inside were several pages, filled with that same handwriting. I began to read. "My dearest Liam," it started. "If you are reading this, then it means two things. First, that I am gone. And for that, son, I am more sorry than words can ever say. Second, it means you found your way here. You found the Ark. I knew you would. You always had my curiosity, my inability to leave a puzzle unsolved." I had to stop and take a breath. His voice was so clear in my head, it was as if he were standing in the room with me. I could almost smell the sawdust and coffee on his clothes. I forced myself to keep reading. "I know you have questions, Liam. I know you must hate me. You have every right to. I need you to understand why I did what I did. It all comes back to this house, this land, and it comes back to the night of the accident." My blood ran cold. He was going to talk about it. That accident was not an accident, son. It was a message. For years, I had been borrowing money to keep us afloat, to try and get this mill project off the ground. I was a fool. I borrowed from the wrong people. Not gangsters from the movies, but worse. Men in suits who use debt like a weapon. They bleed you dry, slowly. When I couldn't pay, they started to apply pressure. The accident was them. They wanted to show me they could get to you, that you were the price. I felt a wave of nausea. The memory I had carried as a stone of guilt was not what I thought. It wasn't my fault. It was a threat. That night, I looked at you in the hospital, and I knew I had failed as a father. I had put you in danger. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I had to disappear. I had to make it look like I had abandoned you. I contacted a lawyer, Ms. Albright, a good woman, and made arrangements. I let the state take you because I believed, with all my heart, that it was the only place you would be safe from them. They wouldn't look for the son of a deadbeat father in the foster system. It was a kind of cage, I know, but it was a cage meant to protect you. My greatest shame, and my only hope, was that you would be safe there until you were a man. I dropped the letter, my hands unable to hold it. The room swam. 2 years. 2 years of feeling like garbage, like a throwaway kid whose own father didn't want him. 2 years of believing I was responsible for his disappearance, maybe even his death. And all of it had been a lie. A terrible, painful, protective lie. I wasn't abandoned. I was saved. I put my head in my hands and I sobbed. I cried for the boy who had felt so alone. I cried for the father who had to tear his own life apart to protect his son. I cried for the years we had lost, the conversations we would never have. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, the dust of the room mixing with my tears. After a long time, I picked up the letter again, my hands trembling. I spent the last years of my life here, in this house, working, hiding, trying to finish what I started. This mill, this land, it's special, Liam. It has a secret. The river runs faster here than anywhere else for 100 miles. It's a perfect spot for small-scale hydroelectric power. That was my dream. To make this place self-sufficient, to generate clean energy, to build something that lasts. Something for you. But the men I owed money to, they don't want things built. They want to own things. They have a shell corporation, a development company, Northwood Development. The name hit me like a physical blow. Northwood, the company with the offer, the easy way out. They've been trying to get this land for years. They know about the power potential. They've been buying up the debt, manipulating the county taxes, all to force a foreclosure. Their offer to you, the one I'm sure Ms. Albright presented as a lifeline, is their final move. It's a way for them to get the land for a fraction of its worth and wash their hands of the whole ugly business. If you sign those papers, son, they win. Everything I sacrificed, everything I worked for, will have been for nothing. I looked around the workshop, at the blueprints on the wall. They weren't for woodworking projects. They were schematics for turbines, for power inverters, for a small, powerful generator that could be run by the river. This wasn't a hobbyist's workshop. It was a laboratory. My father hadn't been decaying here. He had been fighting. He had been building. I don't have the right to ask anything of you, the letter concluded. You have to make your own choice. You can take their money and walk away. No one would blame you. Build a new life, free of me and my messes. Or you can stay. You can fight. The house is condemned. The debt is real. It will be the hardest thing you've ever done. But this place is not a ruin, Liam. It's a seed. The real inheritance isn't the property. It's the choice. The choice to run or the choice to build. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you. Know that every single day I loved you. Your father, Thomas. I set the letter down on the dusty table. The world had been turned upside down. The story I had told myself for years was a fiction. My father wasn't a deadbeat. He was a hero. A flawed, broken, desperate hero who had used his own ruin as a shield to protect me. The weight of his sacrifice settled on me, heavy and profound. The choice he had laid before me was terrifying. On one hand, $6,000 and freedom, a clean slate. On the other, a mountain of debt, a condemned house, and a fight against a faceless, powerful company. The institutional voice in my head, the voice of Mrs. Gable and a dozen foster parents, screamed at me to take the money. It was the sensible thing to do. It was survival. But as I sat there in my father's secret workshop, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden war, I felt a different voice emerge. It was quieter, but stronger. It was the voice of a boy who had just found his father again, not in the flesh, but in the truth. Listen, if you've made it this far into my story, thank you. This was the moment for me, the pivot point. Everything that had happened before led to this, and everything that came after was because of the decision I was about to make. It was the moment I stopped being a victim of my circumstances and had to choose what I was going to become. Have you ever had a moment like that in your life? A crossroads where the easy path and the right path were two very different roads? If you have, I'd be honored if you'd share something about it in the comments below. Reading your stories, knowing I'm not alone in these struggles, it means the world. I looked at my hands. They were smudged with the dust of this house, my father's house, my house. I thought about the word he used, ark. An ark isn't a pleasure cruise. It's a vessel built to survive a flood. It's a desperate act of hope in the face of annihilation. This house wasn't meant to be a palace. It was meant to endure. And my father had passed that endurance on to me. I stood up. I walked out of the workshop, leaving the letter on the table, and went down the creaking stairs. I pushed open the front door and stepped out onto the sagging porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cool, and the sound of the river was a powerful, constant roar. The property didn't look like a ruin to me anymore. It looked like a promise, a battlefield, a legacy. I pulled out the cheap, disposable phone I'd been given when I aged out. The signal was weak, just one bar, but it was enough. I found Ms. Albright's number in my call history and pressed the button. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp and professional as ever. "Ms. Albright, it's Liam Thorne." "Liam," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "Have you had a chance to think about the offer?" "I have," I said, my voice steady. I looked at the broken porch roof, the overgrown yard, the dark, imposing shape of the mill by the water. "I'm not selling." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint hum of her office, a world away. "Liam," she said slowly, carefully, "I understand this is an emotional decision, but you need to be practical. The property is a money pit. The debt is real. The county will foreclose. Taking Northwood's offer is the only way you walk away from this with anything other than more debt." "I understand the risks," I said, and for the first time, I felt like I actually did. "There's more to this place than what's on paper. My father, he didn't want them to have it. I'm keeping the house." "Liam, you have $250 to your name. How do you possibly intend to pay a $43,000 tax lien, let alone repair a condemned building?" Her voice wasn't angry, it was genuinely bewildered. It was the voice of logic confronting something that made no sense. "I don't know yet," I admitted, and it was the honest truth. "But I'll figure it out. Please inform Northwood Development that their offer is rejected." I could almost hear her shaking her head. "As your legal counsel, I have to advise you that this is a catastrophic financial decision." "I appreciate the advice," I said, looking up at the darkening sky. "But it's my decision to make." I ended the call before she could argue further. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of my choice. A terrifying, exhilarating weight. I was broke. I was alone. I was standing on a piece of land that was legally and financially toxic. But for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. I wasn't a ward of the state. I wasn't a victim. I was Thomas Thorne's son, and I had a home to fight for. The consequences of my decision arrived faster than I expected. 3 days later, a courier on a motorcycle rumbled down the gravel road. He handed me a thick envelope from Northwood's legal team. It was a new offer, raising the price to $55,000. But the tone of the letter was different. It was less of an offer and more of an ultimatum. It casually mentioned the imminent foreclosure auction and their intent to be the primary bidder. It was a thinly veiled threat. "Sell to us now, or we'll take it for even less from the county, and you'll be left with nothing but the remaining debt." They were turning the screws. I used the letter to start a fire in the hearth that night. I spent my $250 on supplies, a hammer, a pry bar, a handsaw, nails, canned food, and a cheap sleeping bag. I slept on the floor of the workshop, the only room that felt solid, the only room that felt like him. The work was brutal. I started with the most immediate problem, the collapsed porch roof. I was not a carpenter. My father had tried to teach me things when I was a kid, but I'd been too restless, too impatient. Now I regretted it with every misplaced hammer blow and crooked cut. I salvaged what wood I could from the collapsed section and from a fallen shed behind the house. I spent a week, from sunrise to sunset, tearing down the rotten structure and rebuilding a crude, ugly, but functional support system. My hands, soft from years of doing nothing, were blistered and raw within a day. My muscles ached in ways I didn't know were possible. Every night, I would collapse into my sleeping bag, exhausted and sore, and read another of my father's letters. They weren't like the first one. They were more like a journal, a series of notes and observations. He wrote about the flow of the river, the best way to brace the foundation of the mill against the winter floods. He wrote about the species of trees on the property, which ones were hardwood, good for building, and which were softwood, good for burning. He was teaching me, even in death. He was giving me the instruction manual for my own survival. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of clearing thorny blackberry bushes that had swallowed the side of the house, I opened a letter dated just a few months before his death. "They're getting closer," he wrote. "I can feel them. They're sniffing around the county records office. The foreclosure is their endgame. I don't think I have enough time to finish the generator. The prototype is almost there, but I'm missing a key component, and my funds are gone. I have to prepare for the worst. I have to build a fail-safe, a last resort for you, Liam. If they push you to the wall, if there's no other way, you need to look beneath the miller's stone. Don't use it unless you have to. It's not a treasure, it's a weapon, and weapons can be dangerous to the one who wields them." The miller's stone. I spent the next morning in the old mill. The air inside was cool and damp, thick with the smell of wet stone and rust. The main floor was dominated by the massive gears and belts that were once driven by the water wheel. It was like standing in the belly of a mechanical beast. I found what I was looking for on the ground floor, where the main shaft from the water wheel entered the building. There, set into the foundation, was a huge, flat, circular stone, about 5 feet in diameter. It was the bedstone, the stationary base upon which another stone, the runner stone, would have ground the grain. The miller's stone. It must have weighed tons. How was I supposed to look beneath it? I ran my hands over its surface, feeling for a crack, a seam, anything. Nothing. I went back to the letter. Look beneath the miller's stone. Not under it, beneath it. I got on my hands and knees, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I looked at the foundation wall directly below the stone's edge. It was all solid rock and mortar. I was about to give up when my light caught a detail I had missed. A single, small stone in the foundation wall, no bigger than my fist. It was a different color from the others, a darker gray, and its shape was more regular, almost square. It looked out of place. I remembered the loose brick in the hearth. My father liked his secrets. I took out my pry bar and worked the tip into the mortar around the stone. It was tight. I put my weight into it, and with a grating screech, the stone popped loose and fell to the floor. Behind it was a dark, square hole. I reached inside, my heart pounding. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled it out. It was a small, heavy, waterproof case, the kind used for storing sensitive equipment. It was sealed tight with 4 latches. I carried it back to the workshop, my hands trembling again, not from exhaustion this time, but from a mixture of fear and hope. I set the case on the workbench and undid the latches. I lifted the lid. I think a part of me, the childish part, was expecting a box full of money, a magical solution to all my problems. But my father's letter had warned me. It wasn't a treasure. Inside, there was no cash. Instead, there were 3 black, hard-bound ledgers and a single, small USB flash drive. I opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with my father's neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a journal, it was an account book. Dates, names, amounts. It was a detailed record of every loan he had taken, every payment he had made, and every exorbitant interest charge that had been applied. He had documented it all. But it was more than just his own debt. There were other names, other small business owners in the region. He had been investigating. The second ledger contained photocopies of property records, incorporation documents, and bank transfers. My father had painstakingly traced the web of shell corporations and holding companies from the loan sharks all the way up to the board of directors of Northwood Development. Several prominent local businessmen were on that board, men who presented themselves as pillars of the community. The third ledger was the most chilling. It was a timeline. It detailed the pressure campaign, the threatening phone calls, the accidental destruction of a neighbor's crops, the sudden unexplainable code violations, and a detailed entry for the night of my accident, including the license plate number of the car that had run him off the road, a car registered to an LLC owned by one of Northwood's board members. It was all there, a meticulous, undeniable case file proving years of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy. This was the fail-safe. This was the weapon. He hadn't just been trying to save his own property. He had been building a case to dismantle the entire corrupt system that was preying on his community. The USB drive, I guessed, contained digital copies of everything. My father hadn't just been a tinkerer. He had been an investigator, a quiet, methodical warrior fighting a war no one else knew existed. I sat there in the silence of the workshop, the weight of those ledgers in my lap. I finally understood the full scope of his sacrifice. He hadn't run away from a debt. He had gone to ground to gather the ammunition he needed to fight back. He had made himself a ghost so he could haunt the men who had wronged him. The house, the mill, it wasn't just a home or a project. It was his base of operations, his fortress. He hadn't left me a ruin. He had left me an arsenal. And another choice: what to do with it. I could leak it to the press, blow the whole thing wide open. But his letter had warned me. It was a weapon, and weapons could be dangerous. These were powerful, ruthless men. Going public could put a target on my back. Or I could use it as leverage, a shield, a bargaining chip. I picked up my phone. I took a clear picture of a single page from the third ledger, the page detailing my accident, with the license plate number and the name of the Northwood board member it was traced to. I composed a new email to Eleanor Albright. The subject line was simple: Blackwood Mill Property. The body of the email contained only a single sentence: I believe this information is relevant to my case. I attached the image and hit send. The response was not an email. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was her. Her voice was completely different. The crisp professionalism was gone, replaced by a tense, urgent energy. Liam, where did you get this? I found it here, I said, my voice quiet. There's more, a lot more. There was a long pause. I heard her take a deep, shaky breath. "Liam," she said, and for the first time I heard something in her voice that sounded like fear, not for herself, but for me. "Do not talk to anyone about this. Do not show this to anyone. I am driving out there. I will be there in 2 hours. Do not leave the property. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." I ended the call and looked out the window of the workshop. The last rays of sun were lighting up the tops of the fir trees. I had come to this place expecting to sign away the final chapter of a sad story. I thought I was inheriting a debt, a failure, a confirmation of my own worthlessness. But I was wrong. My inheritance wasn't the broken house or the rusted mill. It wasn't even the ledgers full of damning evidence. My real inheritance was the truth. It was the story of my father's love, a love so fierce it had forced him to become a ghost. It was the discovery of my own resilience, a strength I never knew I had, forged in the solitude and hard labor of the past few weeks. The house wasn't just a building anymore. It was a part of me. Its brokenness was my brokenness. Its potential was my potential. My father had given me the choice to run or to build. I had chosen to build. And now I had the tools to do it. The resolution was not a dramatic courtroom showdown. Powerful men like the ones on Northwood's board rarely see the inside of a courtroom. It was quieter, a series of tense, discreet negotiations handled by Ms. Albright, who had transformed from a skeptical advisor into a fierce advocate. Armed with the evidence my father had gathered, she met with Northwood's lawyers. There was no talk of buying the property anymore. The conversation was about making a problem go away. A few weeks later, I received a formal notice from the county. The $43,000 tax lien on the Blackwood Mill property had been paid in full by an anonymous party. The condemnation notice was officially rescinded, pending a basic structural inspection, which, Ms. Albright assured me, would be a mere formality. Northwood Development announced it was abandoning its Hemlock Creek project, citing unforeseen environmental concerns. It was a lie, but it was a lie that set me free. I wasn't rich. The ledgers and the USB drive were locked in Ms. Albright's office vault, a silent insurance policy. I was left with exactly what my father had: the land, the mill, the house, and a dream. But it was mine, free and clear. The work continued, but it was different now. It was no longer a desperate fight for survival. It was an act of creation. The ugly, patched-up porch roof was the first thing I rebuilt properly. I used the money I saved from not having to buy food. The old man from the general store started leaving a box of groceries at the end of my path once a week, never saying a word about it, to buy new lumber. One Saturday, as I was struggling to lift a heavy beam into place, a dusty pickup truck pulled up. The bus driver, the one from my first trip out here, got out. "Heard you were bringing the old Thorne place back to life," he said, grabbing one end of the beam. "Figured you could use a hand." He wasn't the only one. Word had spread through the small town. The story of the big city developer being run off by the deadbeat's kid had become a local legend. People started showing up. A retired electrician who helped me map out the wiring. A plumber who showed me how to repair the old pipes. They didn't want money, they wanted to help. They remembered my father, not as a failure, but as a quiet, stubborn man who had dreamed of making something for their town. By helping me, they were helping him finish his work. The house slowly came back to life. I replaced the boarded-up windows, and sunlight filled the dusty rooms for the first time in years. I patched the roof, sanded the floors, and painted the walls. It was still a work in progress, a patchwork of old and new, but it was warm and dry. It was a home, my home. One day, I finally cleared a path down to the river and stood before the great silent water wheel. I had my father's blueprints. I knew in theory how it all worked. It would take years. It would take money I didn't have. But looking at the powerful, churning water of the river, I knew I would do it. I would finish his arc. I often think about the word inheritance. I used to think it meant money, property, things you were given. I was wrong. My father didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a story. He left me a choice. He left me the knowledge that love can look like abandonment, that failure can be a form of sacrifice, and that the most valuable things are the ones you have to fight for. He taught me that home isn't a place you are given, it's a place you build with your own two hands, surrounded by a community you've earned the trust of. And that's an inheritance that no amount of money can buy. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, if you believe in the power of second chances and the real meaning of home, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. These are the kinds of stories I want to keep sharing. And I have a question for you, the same one I'm still asking myself every day. What does home mean to you? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one because I believe that every story matters, especially yours.